Hello. So the first theory about why we dream is Freud's wish fulfillment theory of dreams. So wishes are about us fulfilling our wishes. So we dream about those things we wish we could do. But it's a lot more complicated than that because we're dealing with Freud. Now, back in the prologue, I mentioned Freud. He's not really a scientist, right? He's not. He wasn't a psychologist either. His theory is really wacky. So you need to know the id, the ego, and the superego. You need to know about those for this chapter in order to make sense of Freud's wish fulfillment theory of dreams. So you can find these talked about in specifically in chapter 14 of your textbook, which is the personality chapter. So they talk about Freud first in that chapter 14 on personality, and they talk about his notion of the id, the ego, and the superego there. So you can find these details there, but you need to know this information for chapter 3. So you have the id, ego, and superego. These are three parts of the mind, or personality, according to Freud. Now the id, I-D, the id, is unconscious. It's part of the unconscious mind. The id, he believed, was ruled, governed by the pleasure principle. The id basically wants nothing but pleasure all the time. That's all it wants. Now this is an unconscious part of your mind, though. You're not aware of this on a conscious level. But unconsciously, the id, it just wants nothing but pleasure. It wants sex, food, relaxation, warmth, sex, food, relaxation, warmth. It just wants that. That's all it wants. That's what the id wishes it could have. And so the wish fulfillment part of the theory for dreaming, the wishes are coming from the id, from your unconscious mind. That's where the dreams are really coming from. Okay? Now at the opposite end from the id is the superego. The superego, part of it's unconscious and part of it is conscious as well. But you can think of the superego as being kind of like the cop on the beat or your conscience. And the superego's job is to keep the id pushed down in the unconscious mind so that the id cannot express its wishes. Right? So that's what the superego is about. So that the id and the superego are constantly duking it out, right? In your unconscious mind, the superego's job is to keep the id repressed, right? Down there. Don't let those impulses become conscious, because it can threaten our sense of self. And kind of our sense of self is the ego, ego, the ego, what tries to balance out those two extremes, right? So the ego is ruled or governed by the reality principle, according to Freud, right? The reality principle. So, you've got the id. And Freud was all about sex and weird stuff. So you got the id that wants sex all the time with everyone we see. The superego says, no, never, that can never happen, we're never going to allow that to happen. The ego, caught between those two extremes, tries to balance them out and say, okay, well, we'll get married and have sex with one person. Right? So that's kind of the dynamics of these three parts of the mind or personality, according to Freud. Now, when we go to sleep, the superego is weakened when we go to sleep. All right? So it's not on top of things as much as it would normally be when we're awake. So it's weakened. And so when we go to sleep, the id is to start creeping up, is to start expressing those desires from the id, right? So the id creates the dream. The id wishes it could have sex all the time. And so that's where the wish is coming from for the dream. That's what creates the dream, these wishes from the id. Now, so the id is to start expressing these wishes, but the superego is with it just enough to disguise those wishes from the id. Right? So where a dream really comes from, where it originates, is these unconscious desires from the id. That's creating the dream, right? And that's what the dream is really about, is what the id wishes. So what a dream is really about is basically this latent content, right? There's the latent content of a dream. That's what the dream is really about. But that's not the contents of the dream. That's underlying those contents what it's really about. That's the latent content. Now the superego is with it just enough to disguise, right, those wishes, creating the manifest content, or what on surface the dream seems to be about. Okay? So if you're a Freudian, you have to determine what is the manifest content of the dream. You want your patient to share the events in the dream, right? But then you've got to interpret that and find out what the dream is really about, which is the latent content, right? So I just have to say it bluntly with the Freudian stuff. So maybe if you're dreaming about riding a train through tunnel after tunnel after tunnel, or you're dreaming about a big battle with cannons firing off, that, on the surface, that's what it seems to be about. That's the manifest content. But what is it really about? What's the latent content? Sex, right? That's kind of the Freudian approach. So you always have the latent content of the dream and the manifest content of the dream when you're looking at Freud's wish fulfillment theory of dreams. All right, so that's wish fulfillment theory, and then we'll talk about the others.